everyone, welcome to the first part of lecture for this first module on the physical foundations. And so during this module, we are going to cover the region pre-European contact, which is what we're going to be talking about today in this part of the lecture. Then we're going to move on in part 2 to the mission period. And then we're going to look at Alta California, or basically the big pink area on the map, Upper California, but focusing on the part that's actually the state of California now. So that area and what happened after Mexican independence. We want to remember that for this entire module, when we're speaking in terms of colonial times, California is part of Mexico. It's not until later that it becomes part of the United States, which I'll talk about later. So how do we know what was happening here before European contact, before gobs and gobs of written records? There's a couple of ways. Chapter 1, your first chapter reading talked about Pablo Tac. He was a Luiseño, Native American, and although he was born during the mission period and lived at a mission, he was baptized at the mission San Luis Rey in 1822, and then he traveled on to Mexico City and then Rome, where he died in 1841. He did not live very long. He documented both contact with Europeans and pre-contact culture that he collected from elders. So he wasn't alive pre-contact, but he did document a lot of practices. This is actually a drawing that he did. So that is one of the ways that we know, in which you'll read more about in your reading if you haven't done that already. We also know through archaeological evidence. This is a picture from the San Diego Archaeological Society, which I encourage you is up near the Wild Animal Park. If you ever have a chance to visit, it's a pretty worthwhile place to go to see a lot of the artifacts that have been found in San Diego County. So through these kind of narratives as well that are passed down to people and the archaeological record, we're able to kind of construct what California was like pre-European contact. And so by best estimates or most agreed upon estimates, California has been occupied somewhere around 13,000 years ago. There are some recent papers out that argue that that could be pushed back as far as 130,000 years for a variety of reasons, but the general agreed upon is that somewhere around 13,000 years ago, people crossed the Bering Land Bridge when it was crossable down and populated the Americas. And so what did California's native peoples look like before European contact? There was an estimated 300,000 people living in the region, and as we're going to see as we move forward, those populations got severely decimated, not just from war, but also from disease heavily, which also played out on the east coast of the United States, where on the east coast of the United States, as many as 9 out of 10 Native Americans died from disease. There was a great diversity of language and culture in the region. You see here a language map and a tribal group map, lots of different tribes, many of whom were interacting and trading with one another, but lots of distinct cultural practices, and I'll mention a few of those in a minute. And again, trading with one another, we know this. We can find things that have been traded. Up at the top there, you see a picture of Chumash shell beads, which were used as a sort of currency, which were traded up and down the coast. And also obsidian, which is an igneous volcanic rock that is particularly sharp and is like glass, really good for making things like arrowheads out of. And so we find these materials in places where they do not occur naturally, so they had to be brought in. And so to give you an idea of some of the different types of tribes that were in the region, this is an artist's depiction of a Chumash village. which was a coastal tribe. Coastal tribes had very large populations, lots of resources on the coast, uh, very hospitable climate, generally speaking. We don't really have reservations on the coast right now, and that is kind of due to Native Americans being pushed inland away from this most valuable land. But certainly there was a lot of activity on the coast, many tribes living on the coast. La Jolla is on the site of a prehistoric Native American village. So that environment enabled that population growth. Again, mild climate, lots of resources able to sustain large numbers of people. Also, lots of fishing culture there, particularly with the Chumash, but certainly in northern California as well, and all the way up and down the coast. And then there were also inland tribes. They had some of the largest populations. They did do inland fishing on rivers. They were also heavily involved in gathering acorns, which was a big food source, but they also had the land. If you think about where we do a lot of farming now in the Central Valley, right? Again, lots of land that is able to support lots of people and lots of food. They lived in, a lot of these tribes lived in permanent or semi-permanent settlements due to the fact that they could kind of have these resources in one place year round. And this differs from the Great Basin tribes. The Great Basin covers part of California, but also throughout the Southwest. And so we're looking at places that are basically over the mountains into the desert. These tribes were more nomadic because they had to travel around with resources. And part of that is due to the salinity of water sources in the area. So if you think about the Great Basin, and if you ever take my physical geography class, you'll learn a lot about this. Basically, there is no outlet for the water that flows into the Great Basin, so it gets saltier and saltier and saltier over time. So if you think about places that we have in the Great Basin, like the Great Salt Lake, or salt flats that are lake beds that have dried up playas, there, even though you have somewhat larger bodies of water there, they don't support the type of large fish populations. And so the Great Basin tribes were more nomadic and were affected more in later periods and less so by the mission period that we're going to talk about in the next part. You're going to watch about the first 18 and a half minutes of a video made by the Kumeyaay, which is a tribal group in San Diego County, which are still very, very active. When we talk about Native Americans, we're talking now about this past period, but we want to remember that Native Americans still here, still exist, are a modern people. And so you're going to watch kind of their perspective on some of the historical aspects of this period, as in addition to their views on the environment and the land, which differed heavily from Europeans. And you're also going to read before your first exercise a paper about cultural landscapes, which I'll talk a little bit about in the next part. Oh, no, I lied. I'm going to talk about it right here. Excuse me. So cultural landscapes are geographic areas including both cultural and natural resources and the wildlife or domestic animals therein associated with a historic event, activity, or person, or exhibiting other cultural or aesthetic values. That's the definition given by the National Park Service, which the National Park Service doesn't just protect natural resources, but also cultural landscape. A lot of protected areas do that as well. But a lot of specific landscapes are very sacred to Native American peoples, and they differ in their perspectives on their separation between them and the land. There is less of one. And so I want you to go to watch that video and then read that paper before you do your exercise, because I want you to think about what a massive effect the Spanish and Europeans coming in with their kind of system of land management and views on just completely conquering the environment, what kind of effect that had on Native peoples in California and their ability to live and thrive. So that is the end of this first part of the lecture. Again, then you're going to move on to watch that Kumeyaay video and read that paper. And then you're going to move on to the second part of the lecture for Module 1.